Hello, welcome to COM 222, Intercultural Communications. Today we're going to be talking about international culture, specifically the Egyptians and the Russians. We're going to use an essay by Polly A. Begley called Communications with Egyptians to really discuss the intercultural issues associated with the communication process. So the primary emphasis will be on aspects of culture that influence intercultural communication between Egyptians and non-Egyptians. The three important aspects of culture that will be examined are number 1, worldview and religion, number 2, values, and number 3, language. One's worldview signifies the common perceptions among the members of a cultural group. Samovar and Porter define worldview as a culture's orientation towards such things as God, nature, life, death, the universe, and other philosophical issues that are concerned with the meaning of life and with being. The Egyptian worldview comes from a culmination of various African civilizations and beliefs. So if you look over onto the right with that map, you'll see that Egypt is in the northeast corridor area, just adjacent to the Middle East. So even though many people consider Egypt to be Middle Eastern, it's really part of Africa, the continent of Africa. So Egypt is a 5,000-year-old civilization, one of the first large societies on Earth. And really, you can go back all the way 10,000 years ago, and there were smaller pockets of civilization in and around the Egyptian area. But in terms of it being a defined as a civilization with cities, a religious belief, a bureaucracy, we're talking about 5,000 years ago, about 3,000 BCE. 3,000 years ago, Egyptians were a polytheistic society with many gods and goddesses, each who had their realm or responsibility. An early Egyptian creation myth tells of the god Atum, who stood in the midst of swirling chaos before the beginning of time and spoke creation into existence. The underlying concept for ancient Egyptians was to maintain harmony and balance. Today, the vast majority of Egyptians are Muslim, which is those who practice Islam. So, we have seen a radical shift in how Egyptians had beliefs, 5,000, 3,000, even 1,500 years ago. Islam is really something that sprung in the 600s and 700s. So it is a part of the Egyptian history, but not the full part. So let's talk about Islam for a minute. The historical roots of Islamic beliefs are important to intercultural communication because this religion influences every part of everyday life in Egyptian Muslim communities. Islam arose when Muhammad, a prophet of God, was visited by the archangel Gabriel, who shared God's word with him, and this became the Quran, which for Muslims is the equivalent of Christianity's Bible. As of 2015, there were approximately 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, about 25% of the world population. They are second in terms of the popularity of this particular religion. Christianity is coming in or somewhere, and that includes all Christian faiths and Catholic faith, about 2 billion, and then you have about 1 billion Hindus. So we're talking about a fairly large portion of the world following this particular religion. Islam has 4 major beliefs. Number 1, it is a monotheistic religion. Allah is God. God created the world. Humans are fundamentally good from birth because they are God's creation and without original sin. So if you're Christian or Catholic, especially Catholic, the whole original sin concept is very prevalent. Muslims don't believe in that. They believe in the innate goodness of humanity, but contemporary societies forget their divine origins. In other words, the further you go away from the Islamic religion, the less pure you are. For each Muslim, there will be a day of judgment when God decides whether each person will go to heaven or be condemned to hell. And if you're saying to yourself, hey, this sounds an awful lot like my Christian religion. Well, Christianity was around about 500 years before, 550, 600 years before Islam. And Islam, in many ways, is a response to the corruption that was seen in the Catholic Church during these times. So Islam, in many ways, was considered a purer version of what Christianity used to be. There are 5 pillars of Islam. Number 1, the Shahada, which is your creed, is your confession of faith. Number 2, the Salat, which is your prayer. It is an important part of everyday life to pray 5 times per day. Number 3, the Zakat, which is giving alms to the poor, and that's expected of everyone. Number 4, Swam, or fasting during the month of Ramadan, is required. And you don't fast for all 30 days. You're fasting from sunup to sundown. And that includes not drinking water. So you can imagine that in a very hot country like Egypt, going through a fasting like this is a very spiritual experience. And finally, number 5, the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca. And it is a mandatory trip for those who are able to make the journey at least once in their lives. Mecca is located in Saudi Arabia. Islam has a universal allure, and it is easy to practice. Muslims from all cultural and ethnic groups are recognized as equal members. Islam does not require complicated rituals or sacrifice. If one repeats the Shahada creed, then he or she is a Muslim. So, again, this idea of taking a religion that's easy to apply to your everyday life, that allows you to feel like a good person, is a very important element in this concept. The Egyptian government has long recognized the power of Islam within the general populace. An ongoing Egyptian dilemma stems from trying to balance Islamic religious laws with attempts to bring modernization to industry and business. The introduction of new technology and Western influences have promoted lenient secular laws that are often contrary to traditional religious standards. So, for example, in Islam, you cannot drink alcohol, but there are going to be bars available because, first of all, Egypt especially has a huge tourist population, and secondly, they are one of the more advanced African countries that expect to do business with the West. Some Egyptians believe that problems in their country are the result of society, especially the government, ignoring the principles of Islam. Travelers or business executives who display knowledge of and respect for Islamic beliefs are more likely to establish friendships and profitable business relations in Egypt. Although religious beliefs are an important part of Egyptian culture, they are only one part of understanding communication with Egyptians. So, when we're looking at this religious concept, it is something that in many ways dictates the daily life of your average Egyptian. However, as somebody who is maybe not religious or is Christian, we can respect another religion. The other thing is there's been a tendency to demonize Muslims because of 9/11 and the terrorist attacks. Well, much like with Christians, Jews, Hindus, and Buddhists, one small group of bad people don't generally spoil the whole group. There are almost 2 billion Muslims, and of that 2 billion Muslims, there is a very small percentage who have the radical beliefs that perpetuate terrorism. So, if we can discover why people act a certain way, their fears, and their passions, then we can begin to understand how to improve communication among people of diverse cultures. Three fundamental values in Egyptian culture are tradition, relationships, hierarchical devotion. Ancient Egyptians thought that every action, no matter how mundane, was in some sense a religious act. Plowing, sowing, reaping, brewing, building ships, waging wars, playing games, all were viewed as earthly symbols for divine activities. Contemporary Egyptians also maintain that their religious beliefs play a pivotal role in family, politics, business, and education. Visitors to Egypt should never underestimate the amount of time that it'll take to establish relationships, new contacts, or introduce technological innovations. The family is the basic building block of society and is the model of interactions throughout society. The people of Egypt fear loneliness and they wish to always be surrounded by a network of relatives and friends. They combat loneliness by placing great value on relationships. So, in much the same way that relationship building comes before business in parts of China, Japan, etc., it's the same dynamic in Egypt. In Egyptian collectivism, family, social, and business are all relationships that are taken seriously and give Egyptians great pleasure. Each person represents a social collective and sacrifices his or her needs for the greater good of that group. A relational focus is also reflected in the blurred lines between social and business interactions. Officials constantly maintain open-door policies and engage in friendly discussions with several people at one time. So it's a much less formal concept than what we might expect in the United States. But that's only because the relationships have been built and developed over time. Hierarchies, according to age, gender, and experience, are crucial in Egyptian society. Ancient traditions outline the proper place and behavior of each person in society. Interpersonal relationships are characterized by a worldview professing the existence of a cosmic hierarchical order. In this ancient society, male and female deities ruled from the heavens, and both men and women were responsible for the collective security of the family. The ancient Egyptian leaders, called pharaohs, were believed to be gods in human form. They had absolute power over their subjects. So, in this context, what you're seeing here is we have, and this is again 3,000 years ago, ancient Egyptians who were believing in a multitude of gods, but there was also the leader, i.e. Pharaoh, who also was considered a god. Hierarchies are produced and reinforced through the language of family and societal communication. In Islam, humans submit to God's will in all matters. God is the ultimate creator, authority, and judge for all people. The first words that visitors will learn upon arrival in Egypt are Insha Allah. The translation is, if God wills it. Muslims do not question their fate because God alone knows their destiny. A part of that destiny for Egyptians is fulfilling their roles in the overall social structure of society. In Muslim families, the oldest male in the family wields authority and power. The oldest son may conduct business or interactions with international contacts, but the father makes the final decisions. And this is very much a carryover from the medieval days in Europe, where the father was in charge. And this was pretty much standard for most societies up until the Industrial Revolution, which was the late 1700s, early 1800s. It is only now, in this generation, in this era of the last 100 years, that we see women being more and more a part of the business experience. But in Egypt, the father is still in charge. Our manner of speech can have a significant influence on another's behavior.
A visitor who learns a few words of Arabic will quickly gain friends in this region. Egyptians are also willing to share their knowledge of Arabic with others. An appropriately timed response of mishmillah, no problem, or inshallah, if God wills it, will elicit approval and improve relations with Egyptians. In many countries, when a person expresses the desire to learn about the culture, their actions are seen in a positive light. No one wants their culture to be made fun of or mocked or made to feel inadequate. So the more curiosity and the more of an open mind you have when dealing with any culture, the better. And that's a very important aspect because people love to talk about their own cultures. It's unique for them and they want that. So it's a great way of making friends and meeting people is to ask about a person's culture. Egyptians used their language to construct appropriate national identities and unity within the population. Arabic is used to convey the Islamic worldview. Classical Arabic, which is also the written language, is sacred because it is the dialect of the Quran. Arabic helps promote unity within a region just as different linguistic styles can cause disunity. For example, bargaining in Egypt is considered to be an enjoyable way to pass time and build relationships. Historically, Egyptians expect and love haggling, but for Israelis, trading was not a pleasurable pastime, but a struggle for survival in a hostile environment. Thus, where bargaining has a positive connotation for the Arab, the Israeli it is reminiscent of a rejected and despised way of life. Political negotiations between Israel and Egypt have been taking place since 1948, and their different linguistic styles have caused more than one stalemate during talks. So to put this in a more accessible perspective with America, the United States, we have a very specific point when we're trying to convince someone, and we can be very pushy and we can be very direct. And a lot of times other cultures may not appreciate that. They want a more soft approach. So again, learning about the culture, learning how to ingratiate yourself into that culture is going to benefit you in the long run, no matter what your business relationships are. Public prayers and ceremonies worldwide are conducted in Arabic, even if the Muslim adherents are not Middle Eastern Arabs. Jihad is an Arabic word from the Quran that has often been incorrectly translated as holy war. The mere mention of an Islamic jihad has been depicted within Western literature as religious fanatics on a deadly rampage, and the terrorist attacks are automatically attributed to Islamic fundamentalists. Literally, the word jihad means utmost effort in promotion and defense of Islam, which might or might not include armed conflict with unbelievers. Although there are some violent fundamentalist groups, these factions cannot realistically represent the whole of Islamic followers. So in the United States, several years ago, we had a serial killer called the BTK killer, and it turned out that he was a deacon of a Christian church. Well, he doesn't represent all Christians when he was killing prostitutes or sex workers. Instead, he represented himself and his beliefs. Egyptians will judge others based on their language and speaking skills. Those who learn Arabic or adopt a descriptive and elegant style of speaking in another language will attain a higher level of credibility while in Egypt. Visitors to Egypt find that travel or business ventures are more rewarding if they take the time to learn about specific cultural characteristics. Egyptian business people appreciate a thorough presentation of your information, so make sure to have research and documentation to support your claims. Your document should include 2 dates, the Gregorian or Western date and the Hijra or the Arabic date. It is useful to have an Egyptian agent to do business with. A local intermediary person will speed up the business process. Business will not proceed until your counterpart decides that they like you. And there we go back into that relationship building. The social side of the deal goes hand in hand with the work-related one. And regarding negotiation techniques, do not use high-pressure tactics. Note that Egyptians are generally tough negotiators, but it really comes down to the idea that you need a positive, close relationship in order for an Egyptian to want to do business with you. The left hand is considered unclean in Egypt. Unless you are handling something considered dirty, always use the right hand. Even included avoiding gesturing with the left hand. And, again, if you go back thousands of years, the reason this dichotomy exists between the right hand and the left hand is the right hand you use to eat, the left hand you use to clean yourself. And that tradition has carried on through all of these millennia. So now we're going to move on to Russia. And we are looking at an essay by Mira Bergelsen. And she was looking to identify the patterns one must recognize when working with Russians. Now, first thing you need to know is Russia is huge. Huge. It covers from Europe all the way to Alaska. And as such, it is the largest country landmass in the world. Of course, 3,000 miles of that area is Siberia and ice covered, so it's not really habitable as much as just valuable for its oil resources. Cross-cultural communication issues and their potential for creating obstacles to effective, successful interactions have become a critical aspect in a globalized society. In order to fully understand Russian communication behaviors, one must have an appreciation of the basic cultural values which form the Russian worldview. And again, this worldview perspective is very important when working with any culture. For example, in Russia, personal space is not an option. Your space is their space. Americans prefer more personal space than Russians do. So in the United States, we feel comfortable when somebody's about 18 inches to 24 inches away from us. In Russia, they might be 4 inches from your nose, and that is a normal thing. So communication begins before any words are even spoken. Linguistic research of cross-culture communication and related cultural anthropology topics generally agree that the basic cultural values which indicate a culture's worldview are often reflected in certain key words or key concepts. Weisbecker's influential book on cross-cultural pragmatics provide generalization about the basic values and features of Russian culture. Cross-cultural pragmatics compare different cultures based on the investigation of certain aspects of language use, such as speech acts, behavior patterns, and language behavior. For Russians, expressing the way you feel, whether it be good or bad, and the attention to what others people say about their feelings is considered to be appropriate in a wide variety of contexts. From this, it is clear for Russian relationships are more important than the contextual reality. So again, we have another culture where that building of a relationship is far more important than the terms of a deal. A Russian cultural feature is seen in language strategies such as heavy use of culturally loaded words like dusha, which means soul, which signals the importance of the inner world, and in the abundance and great variety of active emotional verbs, as if emotions emerge on their own and are not just experienced. In the realm of proper names, Russia is famous for having lots of nicknames, which we call an expressive derivation. Not only towards children as in English, so we call our little boy or little girl, Teddy, Tommy, any of the little nicknames we give them, but also towards adults without distinction of age or gender. These are used in a variety of contexts to express the extremely important role of closeness and intimacy, and to communicate the aspects of feeling between individuals and the subtle shades of their relations. In other words, the ability to express solidarity and politeness by minimizing social distance. Russians have an inclination towards judgmental attitudes, with a tendency for ethical evaluation. Russians are eager to voice their opinions, and people expect and sometimes require from others, moral evaluations of mutual loyalty, respect, and sincerity. This cultural value is reflected in the Russian language by the abundance, as compared to English, of nouns, both positive and negative, expressing absolute moral judgment. The very idea of change can be a problem in Russian organizations when Western managers attempt to introduce and implement new management techniques of constant change. Changes are generally viewed in Russian culture, especially in the more traditional parts, as a threat, and people want to avoid them. Now, over there on the right-hand side are the 9 signs that you are a judgmental person. Doesn't mean that you're Russian, just means that you're judgmental, but you're going to see a preponderance of people in Russia who would agree with most of these statements. Another important aspect is this concept of fatalism, and it is an attitude of having no control over the world. Russians are more likely to believe that they have no control over events. This is also very popular in South America, by the way. This is directly opposite of American practicality when assessing and dealing with difficulties. Americans tend to believe that there is always a solution. You know, this idea that you should never give up, never surrender, is a purely American, United States of America concept. The world is considered an irrational place, and a Russian may behave and think as if they are unable to always rely on objective methods of analysis and logic. This is in opposition to American positivism. So on the right-hand side is a comic called Calvin and Hobbes, which I highly recommend. Go read as many as you can. They are wonderful. So the little boy says, "I've decided to be a fatalist." And the little boy then continues, "All events are preordained and unalterable. Whatever will be, will be. That way, if anything bad happens, it's not my fault, it's fate." And as you can see, when you put it in those kinds of simplistic terms, you do see that this is counterintuitive to how Americans tend to act. Russian cultural values give rise to the following behavior attitudes, which can create difficulties when interacting with Westerners in an organizational context. Relationships are more important than results. Intrapersonal reality can often become external. So in other words, an individual's reality becomes the generalized reality. Things can go wrong or get worse at any moment, and there's that fatalism. One cannot completely rely on objective methods of analysis and causality. And finally, ethical evaluations are important, and there is a tendency toward them. So, there is that thought process of, is this an ethically sound perspective? And again, they are going to have different philosophical and ethical perspectives than we might have in the West. There are, of course, many more cultural obstacles than those mentioned above. On the right-hand side is a little bit of expectations with business. You have to be patient. Don't expect a Russian who is late to apologize because he or she is probably testing your patience. Some Russians will refuse to back down, and final offers are never the end of a negotiation. Can usually get better if you hold out, and you should always be on time. So the Russian may not be on time, but they expect you to be on time. And in there, they're testing, and there's that testing need to see how willing you are to maintain this relationship. Russia, in all its ethnic and regional variations, is one nation with one rather diverse culture, and the main divisions in that culture are along slightly different lines between traditional, inherited from the Soviet system, which was in existence from the 30s up until the late 80s, early 90s, and westernized cultural models, westernized being American, Canadian, Western Europe. Therefore, one of the main cross-cultural communication problems for an outsider is deciding which cultural pattern a visitor is dealing with at any given moment with any given individual. So just kind of review some of the Soviet culture, because I know a lot of people today may not have even been born when the Soviet Union fell in the late 80s and early 90s. So some of the more easily detectable cultural patterns of the traditional and Soviet co-cultures include a deep mistrust between the authorities and the people. In the 40s and 50s, Stalin, who was running the Soviet Union, allowed millions of people to starve to death because he did not want to provide any subsidies to the people. He had a mission and he did not care. So authority figures are often not trusted. A general sense of pessimism. A lack of critical thinking and negotiation skills. Little or no respect for laws and rules. By the end of the Soviet era, the 70s and 80s, you saw that the system was so badly damaged that it couldn't function. And so people went outside the functioning laws and rules to survive, just to get food, just to have clothes. A deep-rooted practice of deceiving higher authorities to stretch the truth and to use roundabout ways. And again, this idea of having to go around the authorities to get anything done. And a mistrust of commercial activities. They've been fed a diet that capitalism is really bad. And so any kind of commercial activity is seen as a potential negative. From a Western perspective, these patterns of behavior may seem contradictory, but Russians consider them to be the focus, the central line of their history. It is one thing to recognize that values vary between cultures, but it is of perhaps greater importance to understand how those values influence culture-specific behavioral patterns, especially communication patterns. Certain linguistic structures serve as clues to interpretation of meaning and inferences based on cultural assumptions of the participants. Russians use specific words and phrases that are open to interpretation. Variant communication patterns that bring about misunderstandings or create conflict during Russian-U.S. communication interactions. For example, after Russia invaded parts of the Ukraine, Russian officials stated Russian soldiers are not taking part in military activities in the east of Ukraine, but all those who have died will receive compensation. So we're not doing it, but if somebody did die, we'll give them compensation. After that statement was questioned, they put out another statement that said the Russian dead will be called those who died in exercises on the border with Ukraine. Now the reality is that Russia invaded parts of Ukraine to try and take their land. That's not what they're saying. They're using a very roundabout way of validating or rationalizing what they've done. So a person acting out his culture's politeness and other conversational strategies may seem to be seen as rude and imposing or insecure and indirect, leading to a perception of the person as an unreliable partner or a pushy employee. Russians are more insistent on expressing and reviving solidarity politeness. It normally means a smaller distance between equals, but from a Western point of view, this style lacks deferential politeness, which can create problems for teamwork, especially when the boss expects certain behaviors from their employees. Without an understanding of the Russian culturally influenced communication practices, a U.S. business person may well assign negative or incorrect meaning. The following are examples of normative Russian communicative behaviors that can lead to pitfalls in cross-cultural environments. Now, the first one is communication style is not targeted at reaching a consensus. At least that is how it may be judged by Western participants at a business meeting with Russians. In normal conversational turn-taking, Russians will often start with no or niet, and that automatically puts an American on the defense. Offering wrong or no answers to your questions or knowing better what you need, this means that judgments or good advice are a common Russian response to information-seeking behaviors. There tends to be very little visual or verbal feedback during meetings with Russians. People listen silently and with little obvious body language being displayed. So again, in this sense of I'm hiding, you're hiding, and we're going to try and meet somewhere in the middle, but we have to develop a relationship first. Russians also prefer face-to-face meetings rather than exchanging emails. Another issue is addressee's responsibility for information. In Russia, a person interested in getting information has to ask for it, and those who possess the information, especially institutions, do not feel compelled to provide it without additional urging, i.e., you need this train schedule, you find a way to get it. Then there's the potential mistrust of objective truths. This culturally based feature can be especially disconcerting to the U.S. partners when dealing with organizational issues. Imagine introducing new software to Russian colleagues and get surprised looks and annoying objections. Why should we change? The U.S. member may feel mystified by the need to discuss things that seem obvious. So, in the United States, new phone comes out, we all rush to go get the newest, latest version of our iPhone or our Android. In Russia, people don't want to change. Now, this is Vladimir Putin, a cartoon of him on the right. He is, quote-unquote, the president/dictator of Russia. And essentially, he's kind of the one who created this idea of distrusting the news. And in this cartoon, he says, I make a lot of phony assurances, tell a bunch of lies, and then use the force of government to crush liberty and get what I want. It's called Putin care. So, and you'll see he's crashing Ukraine. The issue that people are concerned about now is the fact that the American president thinks Putin is awesome and wants to be like him, which goes against our sense of democracy and the idea that truth is something that you can prove with facts. Western perception of Russia being difficult to understand has been heightened by the societal changes the country has experienced over the past 2 decades since the Soviet Union fell. The enormous dramatic changes, plus the embedded basic values of the traditional Russian culture, are coalescing to shape the business culture of modern Russia. Research, anecdotal evidence, and personal impressions confirm that in business, expectation gaps between Westerners and Russians, for example, managers, entrepreneurs, professionals, staff, etc., form one of the main obstacles to conducting business, creating successful partnerships, and organizing efficient work teams. On the next slide, we have some of the widely supported statements from both parties that constrain relations between Russians and Westerners. So, Western attitude. Russians don't know how to work hard. Business problems are simple in Russia. Change is impossible in Russia. Russians lack experience and know-how. Russians must follow the Western consultants' advice, and Russians rely too much on intuitive approaches. The Russian attitudes towards the Westerners. Westerners have no appreciation of recent societal changes. Westerners don't know how to teach and how to transfer skills to the Russians. The West has failed to manage effective relationships with Russian partners. Westerners have no interest in the Russian mentality. Relationship management must be based on equivalence. And finally, Russian staff feels undervalued, underutilized, and discriminated against. So these two opposing viewpoints really come down to the fact that we don't see a lot of business interaction between the Russians and Western perspectives like the United States, Canada, and England, France, etc. So this Western attitude has a very negative perspective on the Russians, and the Russians think the Westerners are pompous, prideful, and completely unwilling to bend. So, how do you successfully navigate Russian negotiations? You have to understand that cross-cultural communication in a business setting is going to always have challenging difficulties arising from the culturally varied communication styles and behaviors. The question then becomes, how does one successfully navigate around these potential problem areas? Knowledge is, of course, the answer. Both Russians and Americans have an obligation to be generally aware that culture shapes one's worldview in the form of beliefs and values, which in turn influence communication styles, and all of this becomes manifest in the workplace. But when people of different cultures interact in the workplace, a broad appreciation of cultural influences will likely prove insufficient in preventing misunderstandings and miscommunications. When working towards a common goal, such as a cross-cultural business endeavor, more specific cultural knowledge relating to other business partner is required. So in other words, when you are engaging in business with someone of a different culture, you have to do your homework. There are no shortcuts, and it is vital to the success of this kind of a project. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text message your instructor. If you do not attend our school but still have a question, please leave it in the comments. Thank you, and have a fabulous day.